Greetings and salutations, Internet. My name is Kind Death, and today I wanted to talk to you about why I think High Elves are going to be the next playable race for the Alliance in World of Warcraft 8.0. Now, this video is completely objective. I have no skin in the game for wanting High Elves. I do play Alliance. I'm not so sure that they would add a whole lot to the Alliance at this point other than balance, personally. But objectively, I think that Blizzard has been aiming for this for quite a while, and I'm going to kind of go through and explain that. I think Blizzard's been hinting at High Elves for being playable for a very long time. They obviously had a presence with Valerian Stronghold and Burning Crusade and some of the other buildings. They kind of differentiated themselves by having blue on the buildings and blue eyes, and there was a little bit of their characters here and there. And then we saw a lot more of them implemented in Wrath of the Lich King. We saw them in Dalaran. They were the lead faction of the Alliance in Dalaran via this Silver Covenant. We saw that moving forward with the Argent Tournament, we saw drama that was between them and the Sun Reavers. To also further that story, they gave us the Battered Hilt questline, where we could get Quell Dalar as the sword. And the Alliance end of the story, well, I should say the entire storyline, was very different for the Alliance and the Horde, and if you haven't done it, I recommend that you go do the Battered Hilt questline if you get a chance to. I know it's quite expensive on certain realms nowadays, but if you haven't experienced, you should, because it's a good storyline, but it's very different for Horde and Alliance players. You can look it up on YouTube, some other videos. Obviously, moving forward with Cataclysm, with the whole Garrosh Jaina drama. We know about the defensive Theramore. We know that Varisa and her husband Ronan, who was the leader of the Kirin Tor at the time, was a pacifist. He died in the Mana Bomb attack, but we also know the Silver Covenant fought alongside Theramore and Stormwind soldiers and everything that were at Theramore. We know that they assisted Jaina and the Alliance in the Isle of Thunder in Mista Pandaria as one half of the Kirin Tor offensive. But moving into Legion, we have Varisa, Windrunner's marksmanship hunter questline for Illyria's bow, which tells a lot of Illyria's backstory. And I think if it would have ended there, I wouldn't have been so convinced that High Elves were going to be the next playable race in World of Warcraft for the Alliance. But it was really kind of the Nightwell cinematic with Elisande, where she specifically targets the Quel'Dorei as being peasants playing at nobility. She not only addresses the Night Elves and the Blood Elves, but she addresses the High Elves. Now, why would Blizzard for this many years continue to differentiate the High Elves from the Blood Elves? They must have some purpose, because it seems like after Prophet Velen, for those of that know kind of the Sunwell storyline, he basically cleansed the Sunwell of corruption, and it became a font of holy power, and the Blood Elves stopped draining off of more or less the Fel Crystals and mana off other substances. So you would think at that point that the High Elves and the Blood Elves would have naturally reintegrated at that point, and they would have maybe settled their differences. That is not what happened in the game. So my main question here is why? Why has Blizzard decided to take this course and continue to tell the story of the High Elves and the Quel'Dorei as separate and try to delineate them from the Blood Elves in the story? I find that to be very interesting. Now, again, this is all speculation, but I think it's leading to something else. And I think that something else is coming up very quickly. It's very likely that Jaina is going to be the main protagonist, at least for the Alliance, and in what is going to be Cataclysm 2.0, if I had my guess. And anybody that follows Jaina there's going to be a vestige of people who were part of the Kirin Tor, people that were part of the Silver Covenant, which are High Elves, and people that were part of Theramore. So she kind of has this gangly, motley crew of these people, but there's going to be High Elves included with wherever Jaina tags along to. So, I mean, they did help her found Theramore in the lore in Warcraft 3. As we know, moving forward, Eretor, he's represented as a High Elf in the game. Obviously, I think he's going to be one of the most important, if not the most important character moving forward. He's the bridge between the shadow and the light in his mother and his father. I think it would be really weird to have Illyria, Varisa, and Eretor, who are all of High Elf blood, and they've done so much work in trying to separate High Elves from Blood Elves in the story, to not have a playable race within the game, because they've made it very clear that these aren't Blood Elves. Races do not represent entire races. They're only factions. What we're playing is a faction of our race, such as the humans that we're playing are from Stormwind. They're not from Lordaeron. They're not from anywhere else other than Stormwind. The dwarves we play are Bronzebeard dwarves. They're not from anywhere else. They are from Ironforge. The trolls that we play in the game are Darkspear trolls. They're from nowhere else. You should also note that Worgen are playable cursed humans. If you use 2 forms and you're not in combat, you're technically a human. So we have 2 humans in the game, and they're on one faction. That kind of thing leads me to believe that Blizzard's willing to play with this a little bit, and they're kind of willing to play fast and loose. And for some reason, they seem to have a connection to High Elves, and just really trying to separate them out. But I think if they are ever going to add High Elves as a playable race, it's now or never. If we don't see it announced at this BlizzCon, at this expansion announcement, I don't think we'll probably ever see High Elves as playable. I think this is kind of their moment in the sun, and if they're going to come forward, this is probably likely it. I think a lot of the common arguments that people have, I guess, against Blood Elves don't really hold water, at least to me. Or there are things that are fairly easy for Blizzard to get around. Some of those common arguments that they're a small population, there's just not enough of them to play in the game. That's not factually accurate. There's supposed to be very few gnomes. Most of them were eradicated in Gnomeregan. We know that the Darkspear trolls were almost eradicated during Warcraft 3. Thrall saved the last vestige of the Darkspear trolls. So there's not many of them. The Bilgewater goblins are one faction of goblins that are not aligned with any of the other goblins. They're a very small group. You kind of get where I'm going with this. These aren't large factions. Just because they're playable doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have a large population. Not to mention that those faction numbers, that we're playing in the scope of reality here when we're in a fantasy world. And this is true for evolution. We don't live in a Darwinian universe in World of Warcraft. Creatures mutate and change races instantly or near instantly. We can look back to when the Night Elves became Naga, for example, or when the Eridar became the Red Eridar, the corrupted ones, and the remaining Eridar that were still blue renamed themselves Draenei and left. These were instantaneous or near instantaneous transformations in races. So there is some story that they could tell or justify that could make sense of using this fel crystals and this fel magic that Blood Elves use, changed their personalities, changed their... We already know that they kind of moved away from frost magics and more orderly control things to fire magics and being more volatile in personalities than they were as High Elves. There's some things in the stories that make sense for that. Another argument that I hear all the time is that I don't want any more elves. There doesn't need to be any more elves in the game. Well, there's a lot of people that don't like elves that are saying that, and there's a lot of Blood Elf players that are saying that because they don't want to feel like they're second-class citizens, or they don't feel special, like a special snowflake, which I can understand, I can respect to a certain degree, but the fact of the matter is Blood Elves are the most popular race in the game, guys. They are 1/5 of the 110s played in the game. That's right, I said 1/5. That's more than 40% of the Horde is Blood Elf characters at 110. They comprise almost 21% of all characters played at 110. The next races are humans and Night Elves at 15 and 16% respectively. Now, when you think about that, well, that's not a huge gap, look at 5 or 6%. Well, if you look down the list at the other playable races and you see the ones that are below 5%, which is large, the gap between humans and Blood Elves is larger than the entirety of some of these races being played, and you can name those off. That's Worgens, Dwarves, Gnomes, Goblins, Pandaren. All are less represented than that gap just between Blood Elves in first and humans in second. Another argument I hear pretty frequently is High Elves are Blood Elves. Well, like I said, races in World of Warcraft can instantly diverge or very quickly, and races aren't races necessarily. What we're playing is factions of races. To kind of end this video, my end question is, why is Blizzard continuing to emphasize the High Elves, also known as the Kaldori? why do they continue to tell their own distinct story separate from the Blood Elves, although the Sunwell has been restored, and that they could rejoin the Blood Elves and they could make a very quick storyline and just kind of tie them in, and people would just forget about it. Yet they continue to put them in the storyline, and they continue to differentiate them, and they continue to make some of their characters the most important characters in the game. And it's kind of weird that the High Elves have had this much face time and this much lore in the in-game storyline. They've gotten more than the Worgans, the Goblins, the Gnomes, the Dwarves. Like, most races have not, that are playable, have not gotten the kind of story time that the High Elves have gotten. And that leads me to question what the motivations is for that at Blizzard. Why are they trying to do that? And I think the only logical conclusion I can come to is that they want them to be playable at some point. And I think if this is the point, after the return of Illyria and the reunification with Erator, and she meets up with Varisa, and all this, the Windrunner sisters are back together again, and, you know, they're all accounted for in-game, and they're probably headed for, you know, for bumping heads. It just makes sense to me. I could be wrong. I could be very wrong. And it's not necessarily that I'm arguing that I want this to happen. I'm kind of neutral on it. I don't think ethereals are, like I said in my previous video, I don't think ethereals are probably going to happen. At least not this expansion. There's just not a whole lot of lore. I mean, they could. It's entirely possible. They've done it with Worgans. They did it with Pandaren. There's not a whole lot of backstory or lore there. And I don't think we're quite ready yet to go out to the Void. I think we're going to be fighting a lot of the old gods later on in the expansion. And I think it's going to be mainly Alliance versus Horde. I don't see any reason for ethereals to be tied in. I do think it's possible that ogres could be, especially if they do add High Elves. I think that increases the chances of ogres being playable dramatically. I also think Naga is not nearly as impossible as some people have thought in the past. I think that Naga is one of the most requested races to be playable in the game. Like it or hate it, it's kind of like High Elves. High Elves are also up there. They're kind of a love-hate race as well. People either love them or they hate them. There's not a whole lot of people that fall neutral in between. But I think a lot of the mechanics of how do they wear boots, how do they wear, you know, what kind of mounts do they ride, I think Blizzard has thought about that for a long time. There's ways that they can get around that. Other games have done that with other snake-like creatures, and it's not too hard for them to kind of get imaginative, and it almost probably, truth be told, probably gets their imaginative juices going. You know, it probably gives them like, how do we do this? And it might be kind of something that excites them. So I can see Naga being very playable too. Like I said, I do think there's going to be two races playable. Probably the most likely scenario is probably Ethereals and Naga if we're based on logic. But there's some part of me that just can't scrape away a lot of the lore and kind of what we've seen and what they've done with High Elves that makes me really believe that they really want to integrate them into the game. And I don't see there being any other window after this point in the storyline of World of Warcraft where they could integrate High Elves other than like a sub-race option. If High Elves are added, I think it's much more likely ogres are added to kind of kick off that Warcraft 2 nostalgia. If they are not added, I think that drops the chances of ogres pretty substantially, obviously, because they're obviously probably not aiming for that Warcraft 2 nostalgia. There hasn't been a whole lot of story. I thought Warlords of Draenor would have been a great spot to add ogres, but as we know that didn't happen. But we're almost guaranteed to get 2 new races in this expansion. It's almost guaranteed. The last time we got 2 new races was Cataclysm, the first Cataclysm. So if this is Cataclysm 2.0, it makes sense as well. So long story short, that's my ups and downs on High Elves and why I think that there's a very good likelihood that they are going to be a playable race in this coming expansion. I've been Kind Death, everybody. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed this or any of my other videos, please follow, like, subscribe. You can follow me on Twitch and Twitter as well. Have a good day.